Eleanor had always considered her life a tapestry woven with threads of deep contentment and unwavering love. For 43 years, Arthur had been her anchor, her confidant, the steady beat of her existence. Their marriage wasn't just a union. It was the foundation of everything she cherished. Their son, Owen, was a testament to their love, a kind and earnest man who had blossomed under their guidance. And then there was Serafina, Owen's wife, a woman Eleanor had welcomed into their family with open arms, believing she was adding another layer of joy to their seemingly perfect life. Eleanor often found herself gazing at photographs of their family, a quiet smile gracing her lips, feeling truly blessed. She had created a beautiful home, raised a wonderful son, and loved a good man. What more could a woman ask for? Tonight, as the family gathered for their customary Sunday dinner, a subtle discord hummed beneath the surface of Eleanor's usual tranquility. The aroma of her famous roasted chicken filled the kitchen, a comforting scent that usually signaled warmth and closeness. Yet, as Serafina moved about, setting the table with a theatrical flourish, Eleanor noticed an unusual glint in her daughter-in-law's eyes, a flash of triumph that seemed out of place. Serafina's smile, usually sweet, was edged with a predatory certainty. Arthur, typically the most jovial at the dinner table, seemed unusually subdued, his gaze darting away from Eleanor's whenever their eyes met. A flicker of unease, faint as a moth's wing, brushed against Eleanor's heart. The dinner commenced, the clinking of cutlery and polite conversation attempting to mask the unspoken tension. Serafina, however, was determined to dominate the narrative. She subtly, almost imperceptibly, drew attention to her stomach, often resting a hand there with an exaggerated delicacy. Then, with a sudden, unsettling intensity, she began to speak about devotion and the sanctity of marriage vows. Her words, meant for general discourse, felt pointed, each syllable imbued with a strange, unsettling edge that seemed directed solely at Eleanor. True devotion, Serafina mused, spearing a piece of roast potato, is about unwavering loyalty, about the commitment to vows that bind a couple, regardless of time or circumstance. Eleanor felt a prickle of discomfort. Why was Serafina suddenly so fervent about this topic? Owen, bless his oblivious heart, remained entirely unaware of the undercurrents. He was too busy savoring his mother's cooking. "Mom, this chicken is incredible, as always," he exclaimed, his voice full of genuine delight. "You always outdo yourself." Eleanor offered him a weak smile, grateful for his simple appreciation. But her gaze was drawn to Arthur, who continued to pick at his food in silence, refusing to meet her eyes. His usual booming laughter was absent, replaced by a quiet, brooding intensity. Then, Serafina dropped the bomb. With a dramatic pause, she cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. Her hand once again went to her stomach, this time with a pronounced gesture. "There's something important Owen and I need to share with you all," she announced, her voice trembling, but Eleanor recognized it as performative. Owen beamed, seemingly catching on to her cue. "We're going to have a baby," Serafina declared, her voice swelling with faux emotion. Owen gasped, his face lighting up with unadulterated joy. He reached across the table, taking Serafina's hand and showering it with kisses. "A baby, Mom. Can you believe it? I'm going to be a father." Eleanor's world tilted. A cold, nauseating twist churned in her stomach, threatening to make her beautiful meal come back up. The air suddenly felt thin, her breathing shallow. Her gaze, despite her best efforts to control it, drifted to Serafina, and there it was. The triumphant look, sharp and malicious, that Serafina shot directly at Arthur. It was a fleeting glance, barely a blink, but it contained a universe of shared secrets, a conspiracy of betrayal that slammed into Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. In that single, damning moment, the jigsaw pieces of Arthur's discomfort, Serafina's strange pronouncements, and her triumphant sneer clicked into place, forming a horrific picture. Owen's jubilant cries filled the room. "A baby! A baby!" His innocent joy, however, was a cruel counterpoint to the earthquake erupting within Eleanor. He was celebrating a life that, for Eleanor, represented the death of her own. As Owen continued his joyous exclamations, hugging Serafina tightly, Serafina subtly leaned towards Eleanor, her eyes still glinting with malicious pleasure. Her lips barely moved, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for Eleanor's ears, a chilling hiss that would forever scar her memory. "I'm pregnant with your husband's baby, you tacky old woman." The words hit Eleanor like a physical punch, stealing her breath. Her mind reeled, the world around her blurring into an indistinguishable haze of color and noise. Her meticulously built life, her sacred marriage, her very identity, felt as if they were crumbling into dust. Yet, an instinct she didn't know she possessed took over. A strange, almost hysterical laugh escaped her lips, brittle and sharp. She met Serafina's triumphant stare with a gaze that, despite the internal maelstrom, was unnervingly calm. "Don't worry, dear," Eleanor replied, her voice steady, even pleasant. "Everything will work out just fine." Serafina's face, usually so composed, contorted with a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. Eleanor's composure clearly threw her. She had expected shock, tears, a dramatic collapse, anything but this serene, almost dismissive response. But inside, Eleanor felt her entire world disintegrate, piece by agonizing piece. The laughter, the calm words, were a desperate shield against the abyss that had just opened beneath her feet. The rest of the dinner passed in a surreal blur for Eleanor. She mechanically went through the motions, nodding, smiling, offering congratulations, all while her heart was shattering into a million fragments. Owen's pure, uncomplicated joy was a constant, agonizing reminder of the deceit that had been woven around them, a beautiful lie that she could not bear to expose. Not yet. Each grandma from Owen was a stab to her soul, a cruel irony. Later, as Serafina and Owen were busy cooing over baby names in the living room, Eleanor found Arthur in the kitchen, clearing the dishes. His back was to her, his shoulders hunched. The silence was deafening, thick with unspoken truths. "Arthur," she began, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "What has she done?" He flinched, dropping a plate, which shattered on the tiled floor. The sound was sharp, final. He turned, his face pale, riddled with guilt and fear, but his eyes refused to meet hers. "Eleanor, he stammered. His voice choked. He took a step back, then another, retreating from her accusation, from the enormity of his betrayal. Without another word, he turned and fled the kitchen, leaving her amidst the broken china, the lingering scent of roast chicken, and the devastating news that now lay heavy and cold around her. Eleanor stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on her, amplifying the roar of betrayal in her ears. The broken plate at her feet mirrored her shattered life. She eventually cleaned up the shards, each movement numb, mechanical. That night, sleep was a cruel stranger. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the whispers and the triumphant glint in Serafina's eyes replaying endlessly. 43 years, a lifetime of love, trust, and shared dreams, all reduced to a lie. A betrayal whispered across a dinner table. She questioned everything. Her perception, her choices, the man she had loved, the life she had built. The quiet, insidious nature of the deceit gnawed at her, leaving her hollow and profoundly alone. The morning after the catastrophic dinner dawned with a cruel, indifferent brightness. Eleanor moved through her routine like a ghost in her own home, each action mechanical, devoid of the usual joy. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, once a comforting signal of a new day, now felt stale, mocking. Arthur, usually a boisterous presence at the breakfast table, was unnaturally quiet. His movements stiff and deliberate. He avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on his newspaper, the pages rustling with an agitated rhythm. His distant behavior, once a vague annoyance, now felt like a concrete barrier, solid and impenetrable, built from lies and betrayal. As she sipped her lukewarm coffee, Eleanor's mind drifted back, sifting through the recent past, suddenly seeing everything in a stark, revealing light. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and meaningless, now began to connect with chilling precision. There were Arthur's increasingly frequent, odd showers, taken at unusual times, late in the evening after working late or first thing in the morning, even when he hadn't left the house. He'd always been meticulous, but this felt different, more like washing away something he wanted to forget, or perhaps covering up a scent. Then there were the credit card statements she'd casually glanced at, noticing charges from florists and upscale boutiques she didn't recognize, which Arthur had always dismissed with a vague, dismissive wave of his hand, muttering, "Just some birthday surprises, darling. Don't spoil it." She hadn't pressed, trusting him implicitly. Now, those surprises felt less like gifts for her, and more like secret offerings for someone else. She remembered Serafina's increased visits, particularly on weekdays when Owen was at work. Eleanor, always a gracious hostess, had initially welcomed these visits, thinking it was lovely for Serafina to spend time with her in-laws. But often, Serafina wouldn't seek out Eleanor. Instead, she would find Arthur, often in his study or out in the garden, and they would engage in quiet, hushed conversations, always about gardening. Eleanor would sometimes overhear snippets. "The roses need care. A new variety for the border." Innocent enough on the surface. But now, the memory of Serafina's lowered voice and Arthur's attentive posture sent a shiver down her spine. And the roses. Serafina had never shown any particular interest in gardening before, yet, over the past few months, she had suddenly developed a passionate interest in their rose bushes. Often suggesting new varieties or discussing pruning techniques with Arthur, despite knowing next to nothing about horticulture. Eleanor recalled Serafina's subtle gestures towards Arthur during these gardening consultations. A gentle touch on his arm, a lingering hand on his shoulder as she pointed to a bloom, a shared glance that held more than just horticultural advice. At the time, Eleanor had simply dismissed them as affectionate gestures between family members. Now, they screamed of intimacy, of a connection that went far beyond mere in-laws. The phone rang, jolting Eleanor from her tormented reverie. It was Owen, his voice bubbling with unadulterated excitement. "Mom, isn't it wonderful? A baby!" Eleanor forced a smile into her voice, congratulating him again, her heart aching for his blissful ignorance. Then Owen added, "You know, Serafina actually told Dad about the pregnancy last week. She said she needed his support, his reassurance before telling everyone else. She always respected his wisdom so much." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Last week, a week before the dinner, before the grand announcement, his support, his reassurance. It clicked, the triumphant look, the whispered venom, Arthur's silent guilt. It all came crashing together in a tidal wave of horrifying clarity. Serafina hadn't needed Arthur's support as her father-in-law. She had needed his collusion. She had told him first because it was his baby, and she wanted to gauge his reaction, to ensure he was on board with the monstrous deception. Every previously dismissed clue, every brushed-aside suspicion, now formed an undeniable chain of evidence. The odd showers were to wash away her scent, the credit card charges were gifts for her, the gardening conversations were their clandestine meetings, the familiar touches were not innocent. Later that morning, Eleanor stood by the window overlooking their expansive garden. Arthur was there, his sleeves rolled up, working alongside Daniel, their kind and efficient gardener who had tended their grounds for nearly 2 decades. Daniel was a quiet, unassuming man, diligently pruning the azaleas, oblivious to the storm brewing within the household. It was a familiar, comforting scene, one that now felt like a cruel mockery. Just then, a car pulled into the driveway. Serafina. She emerged from her car, dressed in a flowing summer dress, radiating a false innocence. Instead of heading to the house, she walked directly towards the garden, a purposeful stride in her step. Eleanor watched, a knot forming in her stomach. Serafina approached Arthur, a dazzling smile on her face. Their conversation was animated, their heads close together. Eleanor saw Serafina reach out, her hand lingering on Arthur's arm, a touch that was undeniably familiar, intimate. And Arthur, her Arthur, the man who had avoided her gaze for days, laughed. A genuine, relaxed laugh. His face alight with a smile Eleanor hadn't seen directed at her in weeks, if not months. It was a pain she couldn't name, a sickening blend of heartbreak, rage, and profound emptiness. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, watching the ease with which they shared this stolen intimacy. After a few minutes, Serafina waved goodbye, her smile still wide, and drove away, leaving Arthur standing in the garden, a lingering lightness in his step. That evening, Arthur was unusually cheerful. He hummed a tune as he chopped vegetables for dinner, a stark contrast to his subdued demeanor earlier. He spoke excitedly about future garden plans, about expanding the rose beds, and even ventured into discussing the upcoming role of grandfatherhood, musing about rocking chairs and tiny booties. "Imagine, Eleanor," he said, a genuine twinkle in his eye. "Grandparents. It's truly wonderful." But Eleanor sensed it wasn't just the excitement of a new baby that buoyed his spirits. It was a deeper, more profound relief. As if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, he was relieved that the secret was out, that the game was set, and perhaps that Eleanor hadn't publicly crumbled as Serafina had surely hoped. Eleanor waited until after dinner, when Owen had called again, overflowing with baby-related enthusiasm, and Arthur was settling down with his evening paper. "Arthur," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil within her. "Owen mentioned Serafina told you about the pregnancy last week. He said she needed your reassurance." She watched him closely. Arthur's face stiffened, his eyes flickering, avoiding hers. He cleared his throat, a nervous gesture. Yes. She was just a bit overwhelmed, you know. New mothers, all that." Needed a calm voice. He stammered, his words rushed and unconvincing. The hesitation, the avoidance, the flimsy excuse. It was all the confirmation Eleanor needed. The truth, in all its brutal ugliness, was undeniable. She couldn't live with this uncertainty, this gnawing doubt that ate at her soul. The serenity she had feigned the night before solidified into a formidable resolve. She would uncover every thread of this deceit, no matter how painful, no matter the cost. Her life, her marriage, her future, they depended on it. The metallic tang of resolve was sharp in Eleanor's mouth. She couldn't live in the shadow of Arthur's betrayal, or Serafina's cruel games. The truth, however painful, was her only path forward. With a determined breath, she entered Arthur's study, a room that had always been sacrosanct, a male domain she rarely ventured into without invitation. Now, stepping across its threshold felt like an act of transgression, a violation of the trust that had once been the bedrock of her marriage. Every fiber of her being screamed against this intrusion, yet the whisper of Serafina's venomous words propelled her forward. His large mahogany desk, usually pristine, seemed to loom over her, a fortress of secrets. She began methodically, opening each drawer, her fingers brushing against neatly organized files, financial documents, and old correspondence. Nothing seemed out of place in the top drawers, just the expected clutter of a busy man's work. She found an old penknife, a faded photograph of a fishing trip, some spare reading glasses. As she moved to the bottom drawer, however, a sense of foreboding tightened its grip. This drawer was usually locked, or so she thought. Today, it yielded with a soft click. Beneath a stack of old gardening magazines, their glossy pages proclaiming the beauty of various blooms, she felt a thin, stiff envelope. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled it out. Inside were bank statements, crisp and official, but from an account she had never known about. It bore Arthur's name, but the account number was unfamiliar, not linked to any of their joint finances. Her hands trembled as she scanned the dates. 6 months. For the past half-year, this secret account had been active. The statements revealed a series of transactions that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Large, seemingly random deposits would appear, sometimes cash, sometimes transfers from an unnamed source. Then, within days, significant cash withdrawals would follow, often in round figures, leaving a dwindling balance. This wasn't how Arthur managed their money. This wasn't their joint account. Meticulously balanced and transparent. This was a shadow ledger. A hidden financial stream. The dates, the amounts, the secrecy. It all screamed of illicit activity, of payments and payouts, of a carefully orchestrated deception. Who was making the deposits? And where was the cash going? The implications were staggering, far more intricate than just a simple affair. With a shaking hand, Eleanor pulled out her phone and carefully, meticulously, photographed every page of the statements. ensuring each detail was captured. Her fingers felt clumsy, numb with shock. When she finished, she painstakingly returned everything to its original place, smoothing the gardening magazines, locking the drawer, leaving no trace of her intrusion. She retreated from the study, her mind reeling, the cold, hard evidence burning in her memory. As Eleanor tried to process this new layer of deceit, Serafina's sleek car once again pulled into the driveway. This time, Eleanor did not retreat from the window. She watched as Serafina emerged, a hurried, furtive glance around the garden before she walked directly towards where Daniel, their gardener, was tending to the rose beds. Eleanor pressed herself against the window, partially obscured by the heavy drapes, her breath catching in her throat. Serafina and Daniel were engaged in an intense, hushed conversation. Serafina's body language was urgent, animated, while Daniel appeared nervous, his eyes darting around the garden, his hands clenching and unclenching. He kept glancing towards the house, towards the windows, as if expecting to be caught. Eleanor noticed the unusual familiarity in Serafina's gestures, a touch on Daniel's arm, a leaning in close, as if sharing a profound secret. Then, Serafina reached into her handbag and pulled out a plain white envelope. She pressed it into Daniel's hand, her gaze firm, unyielding. Daniel took it, his movements stiff. He quickly, almost instinctively, shoved the envelope deep into the pocket of his gardening trousers, his head swiveling around for another nervous check of their surroundings. The exchange was quick, illicit, fraught with tension. Just as Daniel was securing the envelope, Owen's familiar car pulled up, effectively interrupting the clandestine meeting. Serafina, with remarkable speed and an almost chameleon-like shift, instantly straightened up, her face transforming into a bright, innocent smile. She broke away from Daniel with practiced ease, walking towards Owen as if she had simply been enjoying the fresh air. "Owen, darling," she exclaimed, her voice light and cheerful. She gave him a quick kiss, her arm slipping around his waist. "Just checking on the garden with Daniel. I was trying to get some ideas for little plants to put in the baby's room, you know, something calm and natural." She gestured vaguely towards the flower beds, a picture of domestic contentment. Daniel, now visibly relieved, quickly returned to his pruning, his back to them, seemingly absorbed in his work. Eleanor, having witnessed the entire charade, emerged from the living room, offering a practiced smile. "Welcome back, Owen. Serafina, dear. I didn't know you were such an avid botanist now." Her voice was even, betraying nothing. Serafina met Eleanor's gaze, a challenging glint in her eyes, a subtle triumph. "Oh, you know, Eleanor, one learns so much from Daniel. He's such a diligent worker, and so understanding." The emphasis on understanding hung in the air, a veiled message, a taunt that Eleanor felt deep in her bones. Serafina was reveling in her perceived upper hand, believing Eleanor was oblivious to the true nature of her interaction with Daniel. During lunch, Serafina, despite her earlier performance, seemed unusually nervous and distracted. Her usual effortless charm faltered. She picked at her food, her eyes constantly flicking towards the garden, where Daniel continued his work. Her carefully laid plans, her confident manipulations, seemed to be unraveling, or at least, not proceeding as smoothly as she had anticipated. Eleanor watched her, a cold, calculating satisfaction beginning to stir within her. The game was more complex than she initially thought, but Serafina's nervousness was a crack in her carefully constructed facade. Eleanor knew, with chilling certainty, that she was close to unraveling the entire, sordid truth. The heavy silence that descended after Owen and Serafina's departure was thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Daniel continued his work in the garden. But his usual methodical calm was gone. He moved with a jerky agitation, his head snapping up every few minutes to glance towards the house, then the street, his movements furtive, as if expecting someone. The envelope she had seen Serafina pass to him seemed to burn a hole in his pocket. He was clearly rattled, and his unease only solidified Eleanor's growing suspicions. The gardener, usually a picture of simple devotion to his work, was now a pawn in a far more sinister game. That evening, Arthur was a ghost at the dinner table. He pushed food around his plate, barely touching the delicious lamb Eleanor had prepared. His eyes were distant, unfocused, and he mumbled vaguely about needing to replant the roses, a task that, under normal circumstances, would have absorbed his full attention. But tonight, he was clearly preoccupied, his mind miles away, grappling with an unseen burden. The air around him crackled with a silent anxiety that Eleanor could almost taste. The sharp ring of the telephone shattered the quiet. Arthur, who usually let the answering machine pick up during dinner, practically leaped from his seat. He answered, his voice hushed, retreating to the hallway. Eleanor strained to hear, catching only fragments. Yes. Tomorrow evening. 7:30. The usual spot. His face, when he returned, was pale, etched with a mixture of fear and reluctant agreement. He avoided Eleanor's questioning gaze, merely stating, "Just a business matter. Nothing to worry about." Later, as they prepared for bed, he casually announced, "I'll have an errand tomorrow after dinner. Something for the garden supplies store." An errand after dinner? This was highly unusual for Arthur, whose evenings were typically dedicated to his armchair and a good book. It felt like an excuse, a hastily constructed lie to cover a clandestine meeting. Thursday evening arrived, heavy with an expectant tension. Eleanor watched the clock, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. Precisely at 7:30. Arthur kissed her on the cheek, murmured, "Back soon, darling," and left, his footsteps unusually brisk. His car disappeared down the driveway, leaving Eleanor alone in the echoing house, her mind racing. 20 minutes later, as the twilight deepened, Eleanor heard voices, hushed but urgent, from the garden. She moved silently to the living room window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. By the old garden shed, partially obscured by the climbing roses, stood Serafina and Daniel. Their argument was clearly heated, though their voices were kept low. Daniel was gesticulating wildly, his body language distraught, upset. Serafina, in contrast, stood with her arms crossed, her stance rigid, her face a mask of cold fury. She was portraying a story of serious conflict, her head held high, a picture of indignant accusation. Eleanor watched, a cold certainty settling in her gut. This wasn't a simple disagreement. Daniel's distress was palpable. He threw his hands up in exasperation, his shoulders slumping, and turned to leave, walking towards his small pickup truck parked at the side of the house. But Serafina, her face contorted in a desperate scowl, moved quickly, grabbing his arm, trying to physically restrain him, to force him to continue the argument. She spoke rapid, urgent words, but Daniel merely shook his head decisively, his face set. He pulled his arm free with a jerk, climbed into his truck, and drove away, leaving Serafina standing alone by the shed, silhouetted against the dimming light. She looked utterly desperate, her usual composed facade crumbling, replaced by a dangerous, cornered fury. An hour later, Arthur returned. He slipped back into the house, even more withdrawn than when he had left. He offered a quick, forced smile to Eleanor, mumbling something about the garden supplies store being closed. But his eyes were haunted, his movements agitated. He immediately retreated to his study, closing the door behind him. Eleanor could hear the low murmur of his voice through the thick wood, urgent phone calls, hushed and intense. He was clearly in crisis, entangled in something far more complex than she had initially imagined. Eleanor lay awake for hours that night, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying precision. The secret bank account, the large cash withdrawals, the envelope Serafina passed to Daniel, Arthur's mysterious errands, and now Serafina's desperate argument with Daniel. This wasn't just an affair, a simple betrayal of the heart. This was something bigger, more intricate, more insidious. The baby, the money, Daniel's involvement. It was all connected, weaving a complex web of deceit that stretched far beyond Arthur and Serafina. The realization hit her with the force of a tsunami. This wasn't just about her husband's infidelity. It was about a conspiracy, a carefully planned deception with financial stakes and potentially devastating consequences. Eleanor knew, with a fierce determination, that she could no longer remain passive. She needed more answers, concrete proof. Tomorrow morning, she would follow Arthur on his garden supplies trip, wherever it truly led. And while he was gone, She would take the opportunity to search Owen's old bedroom. Perhaps there, amidst the relics of his past, she might uncover another clue, another thread to pull in this increasingly tangled mess. The fight, she realized, had just begun. If you're gripped by Eleanor's quest for truth, don't stop now. There's so much more to uncover in this tangled web of deceit. Like this story, share it with someone who loves a good mystery, and subscribe to follow every twist and turn of Eleanor's journey. The next morning, a dismal, drizzling Friday, dawned with a sky as gray as Eleanor's mood. Arthur, radiating a strained cheerfulness, announced another hardware store run, his voice just a shade too loud, too insistent. Eleanor merely nodded, feigning interest in her toast, but her eyes followed him as he gathered his keys. His hurried departure confirmed her suspicions. This was no innocent errand. The trail of lies, she knew, was only growing longer. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, Eleanor moved. Her target, Owen's old room. It had long since transitioned into a spacious guest room, frequently occupied by Serafina when she stayed over. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of invasion, a profound violation as she stepped into a space that held memories of her son, now tainted by the woman who had brought so much chaos into their lives. The air in the room felt thick with secrets, heavy with the presence of Serafina's recent stays. She began her search with a methodical precision born of desperation. The wardrobe held Serafina's designer dresses, the vanity table, her expensive cosmetics. Eleanor felt a surge of cold fury. This woman had insinuated herself into their lives, enjoying their hospitality, all while plotting their downfall. She moved to the dresser, pulling out drawers, finding neatly folded guest towels, and then, in the very bottom drawer, beneath a stack of Serafina's expensive cashmere sweaters, her fingers brushed against something stiff and unyielding. It was a manila folder, tucked away, clearly meant to be hidden. Her heart pounded as she pulled it out. Inside were bank statements, but not in Owen's joint account with Serafina, or his personal one. These were for an entirely separate account, one Eleanor had no knowledge of, yet it bore Owen's name. A quick glance at the transaction history made her gasp, a dry, choked sound. The statements showed a series of staggering cash withdrawals, totaling over $100,000, all within the past year. Owen, her responsible, financially prudent son, would never have made such withdrawals, certainly not without telling her or Arthur. It was utterly out of character, a monstrous sum that made no sense. As she delved deeper into the folder, her hands trembling, she discovered more horrors. Multiple credit card applications in Owen's name, several of them active, and loan documents for substantial amounts. Again, all in Owen's name, for which he was the sole borrower. Then, tucked almost carelessly within the loan papers, was a handwritten list. It was Serafina's neat script, detailing various debts, interest rates, and projected payments. Some were astronomical. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying jolt. This wasn't just about an affair or a secret baby. This was a sophisticated, large-scale financial manipulation, designed to bleed Owen dry, to saddle him with an unimaginable burden of debt. Her son, her innocent Owen, was being financially ruined, all under the guise of their loving relationship. Eleanor's mind raced, a whirlwind of outrage and terror. Her son was a victim, a pawn in Serafina's ruthless game. She pulled out her phone, photographing every single document, every damning piece of evidence. This was no longer a personal vendetta. This was about protecting her family, about exposing a criminal scheme. Just as she finished and was about to replace the folder, she heard the distinct sound of the front door closing. Serafina. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She quickly shoved the folder back into the drawer, pushed the sweaters over it, and darted out of Owen's room, trying to appear casual. She rushed into the kitchen, grabbing the coffee pot, pretending to be engrossed in making a fresh brew. "Eleanor, is that you?" Serafina's voice, bright and falsely sweet, floated into the kitchen. She appeared in the doorway, her smile a little too wide. Her eyes narrowed, observing Eleanor with an unsettling intensity. Eleanor's hands, despite her efforts, still trembled slightly as she poured the coffee. Serafina's gaze sharpened, a predatory glint in her eyes. "You seem a little flustered. "Eleanor," she purred, her voice dripping with insinuation. "Is everything all right? Unexpected events can be quite unsettling, can't they? Especially with babies on the way, and all the difficulties one experiences." She paused, her smile never wavering, letting the words hang in the air. A veiled threat. Eleanor took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet Serafina's challenging stare. "Serafina, dear, something has been bothering me," she began, her voice steady, despite the earthquake within her. "Why did you tell Arthur about your pregnancy before Owen? My son was so excited, so thrilled. Surely he deserved to know first." Serafina's smile tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face, quickly replaced by a practiced vulnerability. "Oh, Eleanor," she sighed, placing a hand on her stomach. "I was just so nervous. It's a big step, isn't it? And Arthur. He's always been so kind, so understanding. I needed a calm, steady voice, someone to reassure me." She delivered the lines with a perfect performance of innocence. Yet, Eleanor saw through it. "Reassure you about what, exactly?" Eleanor pressed, her voice sharper than she intended. Serafina's eyes danced with a malicious triumph. "Well, you know," she began, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Life is full of stress, financial pressures, little choices that become complicated later. Especially when reputations are at stake." Her gaze flicked to Eleanor, then away, hinting at unspoken leverage. "Arthur, you see, he's a man of principle. He would do anything to protect his family, his son. Even," she leaned in slightly, her voice a chilling whisper, "if it means sacrificing his own reputation." The words were a direct hit, a final, brutal confirmation of Eleanor's darkest suspicions. Blackmail. Arthur was being blackmailed, and Owen, her sweet, trusting Owen, was not just a pawn in an affair, but a victim of a monstrous financial fraud. The game, Eleanor realized, was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Serafina's smile finally vanished, replaced by a chillingly cold expression. The sweet facade she usually maintained for public consumption completely crumbled, revealing the ruthless manipulator beneath. "You see, Eleanor," she began, her voice low and dangerous, "some secrets are far more valuable than others. And some people with a lot to lose, will pay dearly to keep those secrets buried forever." Her gaze was hard, uncompromising, a silent threat that hung heavy in the air between them. Eleanor felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Serafina wasn't just warning her, she was challenging her, daring her to uncover the truth. Just as Eleanor was about to retort, her attention was diverted by a commotion in the garden. Arthur and Daniel were locked in an intense, hushed conversation near the tool shed. Their postures rigid, their faces grim. Daniel was gesturing wildly, his agitation visible even from a distance, while Arthur stood with his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. Serafina, noticing the unfolding drama, quickly excused herself with a dismissive wave of her hand, her eyes fixed on the two men. "I'm afraid I must intervene," she said, a hint of annoyance in her tone, and strode purposefully towards them. Eleanor, driven by an insatiable need for answers, followed, keeping just close enough to hear their strained whispers. As she approached, Daniel's voice, thick with remorse, became clearer. "I can't keep doing this, Mr. Arthur," he pleaded, his hands clasped in front of him. "Owen's a good man. He doesn't deserve this. None of this." His gaze flickered to Eleanor, filled with a desperate plea. Serafina cut him off, her voice like ice. "Daniel, we had an agreement," she stated, her words sharp and menacing. "Remember our arrangement? You uphold your end." The word agreement ignited a spark of fury in Eleanor. "What agreement?" she demanded, stepping fully into their circle, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "What is going on here? Someone explain this to me, right now." Eleanor looked from one face to another, a sickening realization dawning on her. Daniel's face was etched with profound remorse, guilt radiating from him in waves. Serafina's expression was a mask of cold fury, her eyes narrowed to slits, her jaw clenched, and Arthur, her Arthur, stood before her, his face pale, his eyes swollen with unshed tears, burdened by a weight she couldn't yet comprehend. The profound guilt on his face confirmed every horrifying suspicion. Daniel, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, seemed to find a sudden burst of courage. "Mrs. Eleanor," he began, his voice hoarse, "you need to know the truth. There are things about—" He faltered, his eyes darting to Serafina, who shot him a venomous glare. "Daniel, you will say nothing more," Serafina hissed, stepping forward, her hand reaching out as if to physically silence him. But Daniel was resolute. He looked directly at Arthur, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Arthur, tell her. Tell her what's really happening. She deserves to know." Arthur flinched, his shoulders shaking. Tears welled in his eyes, tracking paths down his weathered cheeks. "Eleanor," he choked out, his voice broken, "I never wanted you to find out this way. Never." His words were heavy with despair, his gaze begging for understanding, for forgiveness. Serafina, seeing her carefully constructed facade crumbling, stepped in with a mocking sneer. "Oh, Arthur, stop being so dramatic," she purred, her eyes glinting with malicious pleasure. "The truth is simple. Eleanor, your husband was having an affair. With me. It's a cliché, really, isn't it? The older man, the younger woman." She gestured grandly, enjoying Eleanor's evident pain. A new wave of nausea washed over Eleanor. The affair, she had suspected, but to hear it spoken so crudely, so mockingly, in front of them all, was a fresh wound. She looked at Arthur, her eyes pleading for a denial, for him to refute this monstrous claim. Arthur, however, seemed trapped, caught between two impossible choices. "No!" he cried, his voice raw with anguish. "No, Eleanor, it wasn't an affair. I can't explain. Not without destroying our son's life." He looked at Serafina with a helpless, desperate plea, as if begging her to stop, to let him speak. But Serafina merely smirked, savoring her control. It was Daniel, then, who found the courage to speak, his voice gaining strength with each word. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a pained determination. "Mrs. Eleanor, Serafina has been blackmailing Mr. Arthur. For months, she threatened to expose Owen's gambling debts. Extensive debts, Mrs. Eleanor. Debts Owen ran up long before he even met her. She found out, and she's been using it against Mr. Arthur, making him pay her off to keep it secret from Owen and from you." Eleanor's head spun. Blackmail, gambling debts, Owen, the pieces, the secret accounts, the money, Arthur's guilt, Serafina's threats. It all made a horrifying, devastating sense. "And the baby?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel hesitated, glancing at Arthur, who simply nodded, his face a picture of shattered resignation. "The baby," Daniel continued, his voice heavy, "is not Mr. Arthur's. It's Owen's. And she knew that. But she made Mr. Arthur pretend to have an affair, to take the blame, so that when the baby came, no one would question why Owen was suddenly under such extreme financial pressure. It was all a cover, a twisted, cruel cover to protect Owen and her own greedy plan." The confession hung in the air, a devastating truth that shattered Eleanor's world even more completely than the initial betrayal. Arthur, her steadfast Arthur, had not betrayed her with another woman. He had sacrificed his reputation, his peace, his very soul, all to protect their son from a truth that Serafina, the true villain, was wielding like a poisoned dagger. The pain was immense, but so was the dawning realization of Arthur's heartbreaking, desperate love. Daniel, his voice still heavy with regret, continued to unravel Serafina's chilling scheme. Serafina, she introduced Owen to online gambling. She encouraged him to bet more, to chase his losses. He explained how Serafina had subtly, insidiously, led Owen down a path of increasing debt, isolating him, making him dependent. Then, when he was deep enough, Daniel said, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, she offered to help him. For a price. Eleanor's eyes, wide with horror, stared at Serafina, who met her gaze with a cold, detached amusement, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "The price?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible, struggling to comprehend the depth of the manipulation. Serafina finally spoke, her voice calm, devoid of any emotion, as if discussing a business transaction. "My price, Eleanor, was simple. Silence. Cooperation. A marriage that gives me full access to your family's considerable resources. And, of course, insurance for the future." She gestured towards her stomach with a chilling nonchalance. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture so grotesque, so horrifying, that Eleanor felt her mind reeling. The gambling debts, the blackmail, the fake affair, the secret payments, Serafina's insurance, it all culminated in one final, devastating question. Eleanor looked at Daniel, her eyes pleading for him to confirm her darkest fear. "The baby?" she whispered, the word catching in her throat. "Whose baby is it really?" Daniel, his gaze filled with a profound sorrow and shame, finally met her eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words resonated with the finality of a death knell. "It's mine." The revelation slammed into Eleanor with the force of a battering ram, shattering every last shard of her understanding of her family, her marriage, and the world she thought she knew. Not Arthur's, not Owen's, Daniel's, their gardener, the quiet, unassuming man who had tended their roses for years. The sheer audacity, the intricate cruelty of Serafina's plan, was almost unimaginable. She had orchestrated a scenario to ensure that no matter what, she would be entrenched in their family, either through Owen's inheritance or through blackmail. Using a child that was not even Owen's, Serafina, basking in the shock and devastation she had wrought, gave a slow, mocking clap, her eyes sparkling with malicious triumph. "So, Eleanor," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension, "now you know everything. What are you going to do about it?" Her challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown, daring Eleanor to fight back against a scheme that seemed impenetrable. The confrontation ended in a blur for Eleanor, leaving her reeling, her mind a chaotic storm of information. Owen's gambling addiction, a secret kept hidden by Arthur's desperate sacrifice, Arthur's heartbreaking attempt to protect their son, taking the blame for a betrayal that wasn't his, Serafina's cold, calculating manipulation, her web of lies and financial ruin, and Daniel, the father of the child Serafina was using to destroy them all. The weight of it all was crushing. The next few days were shrouded in a heavy, unspoken sorrow. Eleanor and Arthur moved through the house like strangers, each lost in their own grief and contemplation. Eleanor needed time to process the magnitude of the deceit, the depth of her husband's sacrifice, and the terrifying vulnerability of her son. The image of Arthur, tears streaming down his face, taking the blame, haunted her. He had endured Serafina's cruel charade, not out of infidelity, but out of a fierce, protective love for Owen. Eleanor thought about Owen, her kind, gentle son, ensnared by an addiction he likely hadn't understood until it was too late. She felt a surge of anger at Serafina for preying on his weakness, for using his vulnerability to her advantage. She even felt a strange, detached pity for Daniel, a man caught in Serafina's web, forced to betray his employers, his honesty, his own child. A quiet note, left on the kitchen counter, had appeared shortly after the confrontation. "Mrs. Eleanor, I am so sorry. I had no choice. Please forgive me." Daniel had vanished. A week later, still adrift in her thoughts, Eleanor found herself in the guest bathroom, meticulously cleaning, trying to find some semblance of order in her fractured world. As she wiped down the back of the toilet, her fingers brushed against something stiff and hidden. It was a crumpled, long white envelope, tucked out of sight. Her heart leaped into her throat. Serafina had left it. With trembling hands, Eleanor unfolded the envelope. Inside, dated just 3 days prior, was a DNA test result. The results were stark, unambiguous. Owen Davies. Excluded as biological father. 0% probability of paternity. And then, beneath it, Daniel Rodriguez, not excluded as biological father, 99.7% probability of paternity. Eleanor stared at the document, a chilling realization dawning on her. This was Serafina's insurance policy. This was the ultimate weapon. Proof that the baby was not Owen's, but also undeniable evidence that Serafina had been intimate with Daniel. It was the evidence Serafina would use to ensure her financial future, by pinning the blame on Arthur, claiming he was the father, destroying their family, their reputation, everything they held dear. Serafina hadn't expected Eleanor to find it. She was holding on to this, waiting for the opportune moment to unleash it, to complete her devastating plan. Just then, Eleanor heard the soft click of the front door. Serafina. She was here, probably for another visit, another round of manipulation. With a surge of adrenaline, Eleanor quickly crumpled the envelope back up and shoved it deep into the pocket of her apron, her hand clutching it tightly. Serafina's appearance in the doorway of the bathroom, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor with a familiar, predatory glint, only confirmed Eleanor's resolve. The game was far from over. Serafina's presence in the bathroom doorway was a cold gust of wind in Eleanor's meticulously ordered world. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned Eleanor's face, then flickered to the toilet, a subtle probe for any sign of discovery. "Just tidying up, dear?" Serafina asked, her voice light, but with an underlying current of suspicion. "You seemed rather preoccupied earlier. Did you happen to find anything interesting?" Eleanor met her gaze, a calm mask fixed on her face, the crumpled DNA test burning in her apron pocket. "Oh, nothing at all, dear," Eleanor replied, her voice smooth, unwavering. "Just a bit of dusting, you know how it is. These old houses always have something needing attention." She offered a small, disarming smile, deflecting the subtle interrogation. Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly, but Eleanor's composure held, convincing enough to quell immediate alarm. Serafina simply shrugged, turning to leave, a hint of something resembling frustration in her departing glance. As Serafina disappeared, Eleanor's heart ached with a pain that went deeper than anger or betrayal. It was a profound sorrow for Owen, his boundless joy over the impending arrival of his child, his eager plans for fatherhood, were all built upon a foundation of devastating lies. He was celebrating a phantom, a manipulation designed to enrich and empower the woman who was systematically destroying his life. The truth, Eleanor realized, had to come out, not to destroy, but to end the lies, to break the cycle of deceit, and to allow for healing, however painful it might be. This couldn't continue. That evening, Eleanor found Arthur in his study, sitting at his desk, staring blankly into space. The room, usually a sanctuary of quiet productivity, felt heavy with despair. He looked utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped, his face lined with unspeakable sorrow. Eleanor's heart twisted with a mix of anger and profound pity. She had been angry at him for his perceived affair. But now, knowing the truth of his sacrifice, her anger softened into a fierce protectiveness. "Arthur," she said, her voice gentle. "We need to talk." He flinched, his head snapping up, his eyes wide with apprehension. He looked like a cornered animal, bracing for the final blow. Without a word, Eleanor walked to the desk and, with deliberate slowness, placed the crumpled DNA test results on the polished wood surface. Arthur's eyes fell upon the document, his face instantly drained of color, turning a ghastly white. His breath hitched in his throat, and he reached out a trembling hand, trying to cover the incriminating paper as if to erase its existence. "Eleanor, I can explain," he stammered, his voice choked with despair. "Please, just let me explain." Eleanor placed a hand on his, stopping him. "I know, Arthur," she said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his. "I know about the blackmail. I know about Owen's gambling, and I know you weren't having an affair with Serafina." Arthur's carefully constructed mask shattered. Tears, hot and fast, streamed down his face. He buried his face in his hands, his body racked with sobs. "I couldn't bear it, Eleanor," he choked out, his voice muffled. "I couldn't bear for you to see Owen. To see our son. Like you saw your own father. Gambling. Ruining everything." The pain in his voice was palpable, a raw wound finally exposed. Eleanor's own father had been a gambler, a shadow that had darkened her childhood. And Arthur had sworn their son would never know that kind of pain. He lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen. "I thought I could handle it," he whispered, gesturing vaguely. "The small debts, the quiet payments. I thought I could make it disappear, protect him. But then Serafina. She found out. She found out everything. And she used it. She didn't just find out about his debts. She started actively encouraging him, exacerbating his gambling, getting him deeper and deeper, so she'd have more leverage." His voice was laced with self-loathing. "And the baby?" Eleanor asked softly, holding up the DNA test. Arthur looked at the document with a profound sadness. "That," he said, his voice laced with bitterness, "was her insurance policy. She saw the opportunity, a way to entrench herself in our family. For good, a cover story, you see. For when the baby comes and it doesn't look like Owen. Everyone would assume it was my affair, my mistake. That way, she would keep her hold over Owen and his inheritance. And no one would question why he was suddenly so financially vulnerable." Eleanor held up the DNA test, her grip firm. A new resolve, cold and hard, settled within her. "She's not clever enough, Arthur," Eleanor stated, her voice sharp with determination. "She made a mistake. A very big one." She tapped the document. "This mistake," Arthur stared at her, a flicker of something resembling hope slowly dawning in his tear-filled eyes. What do you mean, Eleanor?" Eleanor rose, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The passive, betrayed wife was gone, replaced by a formidable woman ready to reclaim her family. "It's time for another family dinner, Arthur," she said, a chilling calm in her voice. "But this time, I'm the one with the surprises, and Serafina won't be expecting a single one of them." A quiet, determined fire burned in her eyes. Arthur watched her, a glimmer of relief, a fragile spark of hope, beginning to illuminate his shattered face. The decision was made. The family dinner Eleanor had spoken of to Arthur was planned with the meticulous precision of a military operation. She called Owen and Serafina, her voice bright and cheerful, inviting them for a special Sunday celebration. A belated announcement of their joy, she claimed. Serafina, ever eager for public adoration, readily accepted, oblivious to the carefully laid trap. Saturday was a flurry of activity in the kitchen. Eleanor, with renewed purpose, cooked Owen's favorite dishes: roasted leg of lamb, creamy gratin potatoes, green beans almondine, and his grandmother's apple pie. The comforting aromas filled the house, weaving a delicate tapestry of tradition and warmth, a stark contrast to the cold calculations simmering beneath the surface. Arthur watched her, a mixture of admiration, fear, and a fragile hope in his eyes. They had decided on a subtle, dignified approach. No shouting, no theatrics, just quiet, irrefutable proof. The truth, they knew, would speak for itself. Sunday dawned, clear and bright. Eleanor meticulously set the dining table with her best china, the delicate porcelain gleaming under the chandelier, each piece a symbol of enduring commitment and family legacy. The irony was not lost on her. These very symbols of devotion would now bear witness to the unraveling of a monstrous betrayal. Serafina arrived, radiant and confident, her hand resting casually on her visibly growing belly. She exuded an aura of smug triumph, clearly believing she held all the power, her future secured. She offered Eleanor a saccharine hug, her eyes subtly probing, trying to gauge if Eleanor had truly accepted her fate. But Eleanor's apparent good mood, her calm demeanor, seemed to puzzle her. Serafina's smile faltered slightly, as she couldn't detect the expected resignation or despair. During appetizers, Serafina launched into her well-practiced performance as the glowing, expectant mother. She spoke of baby names, nursery colors, and future plans, deftly deflecting any specific questions about her health or due date, with vague, airy responses. Owen, still basking in his oblivious joy, watched her with adoration, his hand often reaching out to touch her stomach. Eleanor watched it all, her heart aching for her son, but her resolve hardening with every saccharine word Serafina uttered. As Eleanor served the main course, the rich aroma of lamb filling the room, She took a deep breath. This was it. She cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "You know," she began casually, her voice light. "Arthur and I were just discussing how fascinating genetics are, with all the advancements these days. It's amazing what we can learn about ourselves. Isn't it? Even paternity can be confirmed with such certainty now." The word paternity hung in the air, a bell tolling a slow, ominous note. Serafina, who had been mid-sentence about maternity wear, instantly went still. Her fork clattered against her plate, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Eleanor, a flicker of suspicion, then dawning panic, crossing her face. Owen, however, remained utterly oblivious, still happily recounting a story about a baby swing. Eleanor rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, her eyes fixed on Serafina. She walked over to the sideboard, where she had discreetly placed the hidden manila envelope. She retrieved it, her hand firm, and returned to the table. With a slow, graceful motion, she placed the DNA test results directly in front of Serafina's plate. Serafina's eyes widened in terror, her face paling. She reached out, her hand trembling, as if to snatch the document away. But Owen, intrigued by the sudden silence and his mother's strange behavior, reached for it first. He unfolded the paper, his brow furrowed in confusion. As he began to read, his confusion slowly gave way to disbelief, then shock, and finally, utter devastation. Owen Davies. Excluded as biological father, 0% probability of paternity. He read aloud, his voice cracking. Then, his eyes dropped to the next line. Daniel Rodriguez, not excluded as biological father, 99.7% probability of paternity. The document slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering to the table. "Daniel?" he whispered, his voice broken. "Our gardener?" The painful truth, now undeniable, unraveled before their eyes. Owen, his face a mask of betrayal, turned on Serafina. "The gambling," he choked out. "The money. Was this all a part of it? All a lie?" He looked at Arthur, his gaze desperate. "Dad? What did she mean about blackmail? What was happening?" Arthur, his own face etched with sorrow, finally spoke, his voice filled with regret. "Owen, son, I tried to protect you. Serafina found out about your debts, your gambling. She was blackmailing me, threatening to expose you, to ruin your reputation, to bleed our family dry. I pretended to have an affair with her, to take the blame for this baby, so she would stop, so you wouldn't know, so you wouldn't be burdened by her cruel manipulation." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes full of remorse. "I should have trusted you, Eleanor, and I should have trusted Owen to be strong enough to face the truth, even if it was painful." The dinner concluded not with celebration, but with a raw, brutal reckoning. Serafina, her schemes exposed, her power stripped away, was given an hour to pack her belongings. Eleanor, with a quiet dignity, arranged for her to travel to Daniel's sister in Phoenix, a chance for a fresh start, away from the wreckage she had caused. 6 months later, life had begun to mend. Eleanor received a small package in the mail. Inside was a photo of a beautiful baby boy, swaddled in a soft blanket, his eyes bright and curious. On the back, in Serafina's neat script, were 2 words, "Baby David, thank you." It was a gesture of something akin to peace, a faint acknowledgement of the grace Eleanor had extended. Owen, devastated but determined, had faced his addiction head-on. He found strength in his parents' love and enrolled in Gamblers Anonymous, beginning the long, arduous journey of recovery. Arthur and Eleanor, through the fire of betrayal and forgiveness, had forged a new bond, their marriage stronger, more honest, their love deepened by the understanding of Arthur's selfless sacrifice. And 2 years later, a new, genuine joy filled their home with the arrival of a beautiful granddaughter, born to Owen and his wonderful new wife, Sarah. Eleanor often reflected on the ordeal. It was a testament to the devastating power of lies, but more importantly, to the transformative power of truth. Truth, however painful, set them free. Forgiveness, however difficult, paved the way for healing. And love, unwavering and fierce, was the quiet dignity with which one fought for one's family, reclaiming what was lost and building new beginnings on solid ground.